So the lights go down and you get dark and we get blinded. Good evening. My name is, I'm going to find a way to sit. My name is Josh Ginsberg. I'm the president of the Cary Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our third Cary in the City. For those of you who came and heard our spot on WNYC and said, oh, that sounds interesting, I'm going to do a very short elevator summary of what the Cary Institute is. The Cary Institute is an independent research institute based 100 miles north of here in Millbrook, New York. We have been around for 35 years, and we study, I like to say, the things that support life on Earth or occasionally threaten life on Earth. So we study freshwater ecology, we study forests, we study urban ecology and how ecology informs urban sustainability, and we study disease ecology, which will be the topic of tonight's talk. Lyme disease, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, was a rare event, and it wasn't in the news, and we didn't know a lot about it. And increasingly, it is becoming both something people care deeply about and something that is a threat to enjoyment of the outside and to people's lives and livelihoods across the Northeast and increasingly across the country. Why did it expand so quickly? Well, we're going to talk about that tonight, but it's a combination of several factors: climate change, rampant development and interdigitation of people and nature, and changes in biodiversity. And all three of those things together have led to a real change. I am really lucky to work at the Cary Institute. I like to say my staff make me look really smart because I have a lot of staff who are remarkable scientists. Rick Ostfeld, to my right, is a distinguished senior scientist, which means he's not just really smart, but he's been around the Cary Institute a long time. Rick has been working on the issue of the ecology of Lyme disease, trying to understand the ecological underpinnings of the way in which ticks and their hosts interact to produce Lyme disease for 25, 30 years, right, for quite a long time. And he has disentangled this, and so tonight will be a short summary of that. Rick was lured to the East Coast by Gene Likens, the founding president of the Cary Institute. He's a Californian by birth, but he's now so settled in the East that we think we've got him hooked. He did his undergraduate degree at Santa Cruz and a PhD at Berkeley, and came east as a small mammal ecologist. And this is not uncommon at the Cary Institute. People have expertise, but we tend to talk to each other and work together. And he got brought into a project on mice and how it interacts with gypsy moths, and then there were ticks on the mice, and one thing led to another. And that's why Rick is here tonight, and we're going to talk a bit about Lyme disease. So Rick, it's April, and it was 64 degrees out today. And what bearing does that have on the fact that May is Tick Awareness Month?
What bearing it has is that we have discovered by monitoring ticks at the Cary Institute for the past 25 years that as a consequence of a warming climate there and elsewhere, that the ticks are coming out earlier. They are coming out a couple of weeks earlier now than they were about 25 years ago. And so it used to be that the nymph stage, the most dangerous stage in the life cycle of the tick, would reach their what we call questing, their host-seeking activity peak. That's the dangerous time of the year for us, typically in June. And now it's gotten as early as late May, and it's getting earlier all the time. So if the peak of our risk of exposure to Lyme disease is happening in May, then May as Lyme Awareness Month is now a little too late. It didn't used to be, but it is now. So we've been arguing with limited success that we should have April be Lyme Awareness Month instead, so that we have a fighting chance to start preparing ourselves, learning about the tick life cycle, acquiring all those protective clothing, getting in the habit of doing tick checks and the like.
Right, and we will talk to you later about what you can do, but writing your assemblyman and your state senator and suggesting a change in when we have Tick Awareness Month would not be a bad thing. You mentioned the word questing, right? And that is a wonderful, it's both technical and metaphorical and really, I think, explains what the ticks are doing. When ticks go out and have a meal, they traditionally, I think, have evolved to feed on wildlife. Occasionally, they'll feed on us. So can you talk a little bit about the life cycle of a tick, how their questing and feeding interacts both with us and their hosts, and why the greatest risk is in May.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is my bailiwick. I'm a tick nerd, so I freely confess that. Although I prefer not to call myself the tick guy. You can call me the mouse guy, anything but the tick guy. So these ticks are tiny, but they live for 2 years. That's a really long time for such a tiny creature. In that 2-year period, they feed 3 times, if they're lucky. If they don't feed 3 times, they die. And so over that 2-year period, they're actually eating for about 2 weeks. So that's a tiny percentage of that time. And they only eat one thing, and that's blood. And these ticks have evolved in a web of connections, interactions with wildlife of various kinds. This black-legged tick has the interesting habit of being very Catholic in its tastes. It doesn't really care that much which mammal or bird it tries to take a blood meal from. It'll feed on almost anything. And that includes us. So we have inadvertently stepped into a tick wildlife pathogen cycle because we are sort of acting like wildlife. Some of us might be kind of like wildlife. I don't really know my audience very well. But to the tick, we are a perfectly acceptable host. And so when they're seeking a host and they happen to see someone's ankles instead of a furry mouse's tail or feet, then they're happy to climb onto our ankles, look for a nice spot to embed their mouth parts, and take a drink of our blood. Right. And in the process, potentially infect us with not only Lyme disease, but other tick-borne pathogens as well.
And so in their vampiric nature, they don't really care what they're sucking blood from, as long as they get their blood meal.
That's right. I mean, they should care, because there are some hosts that are really good at grooming them off and killing them in the process. Right. We tend not to be one of those. Some of us may be more fastidious than others. I'm not so sure. But most of the people who contract Lyme disease or other tick-borne diseases never knew they were bitten by a tick. Right. It's only in a fairly rare circumstances that people found the tick and then looked for the bullseye rash or some other kind of rash and found it, and then that helps diagnose it.
Yeah, and there are a whole lot of ticks, right? And Rick recently was showing off for a major donor and did a tick drag, and lo and behold, there was a Lone Star tick there. But you focus most of your work on black-legged ticks, and I'm wondering why black-legged ticks and what they do other than transmit Lyme disease.
Well, I mean, they do a lot of things. They do them very slowly, and they do them kind of wimpily too. I mean, they are very poor crawlers. Unlike a Lone Star tick, which can sort of, once it detects you, it can kind of motor at you. It looks like it's going to chase you down and hunt you like a cheetah.
All things being equal.
Right, but so the black-legged tick would be more like, I don't know, a rattlesnake. It's a sit and wait. You have to approach it very closely because it just has a low capacity to crawl very far on its own. But they are an amazing creature. They've evolved exquisite adaptations for blood feeding. Their saliva, for instance, contains a pharmacopoeia of different bioactive products. Analgesics, so that we don't feel it when we're being bitten. It has anticoagulants to keep the blood flowing. It has antihistamines so that we don't mount a strong allergic response to the tick bite. And the bacterium that causes Lyme disease even co-opts the saliva of the tick to cloak itself in chemicals that make that bacterial cell invisible to our immune systems. So this is a system that's evolved over a long period of time, and we're the unwitting victims of this pathogen and the tick that are both really good at what they do, unfortunately for us.
Yeah. And there are some people who do, however, break through that immune barrier and kill ticks, and you're lucky to be one of them.
I am. I was bitten by enough ticks early in my career. After Gene Likens lured me east, he sort of used me as tick bait, I guess.
Fed you to the ticks, right?
So after dozens of tick bites, this was back in the early 1990s, I developed an acquired immunity to the tick itself. And ever since then, if a tick is biting me, even a larval stage tick, the tiny itty-bitty ones, it'll wake it. I get such a strong burning sensation at the site of the bite that it will wake me up in the middle of the night. And typically, I've already killed the tick. My immune system is attacking its salivary glands and killing the thing. So I've offered my blood to science.
Right.
There have been no takers so far, but there are a few people who do this, who've developed that kind of immunity. I'm not alone.
A tick vaccine would have the great advantage of killing the tick, and therefore not just preventing us from getting Lyme, but babesiosis or ehrlichiosis and other tick-borne diseases.
It would indeed, and there is interest among immunologists and biomedical researchers in developing an anti-tick vaccine. So there was a Lyme disease vaccine that was present available in the 1990s. It's no longer being marketed. And one of the concerns with it was that if people get vaccinated against Lyme, then perhaps they suddenly feel safe and they don't need to do tick checks, wear repellents, wear protective clothing, inspect their bodies, etc. In which case you may see a rise in non-Lyme tick-borne diseases like babesiosis or anaplasmosis. An anti-tick vaccine would not have that problem because it would kill the ticks that are transmitting multiple different pathogens to us.
All right, so I was chatting with a member of the audience who will know who I'm talking about before the lecture started, conversation started, and the comment was, from your title, I can tell that deer are not the problem, right? So, blacklegged ticks are also called deer ticks, and the general, I think, accepted popular dogma is that deer are, if not the problem, a serious problem for Lyme disease. But decades of research that you've done suggest that that may not be the case. Can you explain the logic chain that got you there?
Right. So deer do play an important role in the ecology of Lyme disease. They are a very important host for the adult stage in the life cycle. They can also host the two other immature stages, the larvae and the nymphs. And there's a sizable literature on the relationship between deer numbers and tick numbers. And it is extremely mixed. There are some studies that show a positive correlation. More deer means more ticks. But there are approximately equal number of studies that show no relationship at all. We know that deer do not transmit the Lyme bacterium to the ticks, but the mice do. Neither do deer transmit the other tick-borne pathogens. So deer can boost tick numbers under some circumstances, but our long-term data at the Cary Institute, where we've been monitoring mice, ticks, tick-borne pathogens, and deer for about 25 years, show that the number of infected ticks, that's what we have to worry about. It tells us a lot about our risk, is more closely correlated with the number of white-footed mice than with the number of deer. And in fact, after analyzing 20 of the first 25 years of data, we found no relationship with deer at all. By continuing the study, we found a very weak relationship with deer. So it's not as though deer are unimportant, but they appear to be less important than mice in producing infected ticks that can make us sick.
And so a blood meal does not necessarily transmit the disease vector or the pathogen to the host and/or onto the next tick.
That's right.
Okay. So it is blood feeds the tick and allows it to reproduce or go to the next life stage, but it doesn't necessarily transmit it. And why do you think it is that mice are so good at infecting ticks with Borrelia and deer don't?
Well, so we've done a little bit of work with this, and the reason why mice appear to be so permissive, both to the Lyme disease pathogen, the Babesia parasite, the Anaplasma pathogen, is that they seem to have a live fast, die young life cycle that they've evolved. That their fitness is determined by just how many more baby mice they can crank out in a short period of time because they only live for a very short period of time. And as a consequence, it looks like they allocate their limited resources to reproducing at an astronomical rate rather than protecting themselves against infection, which is very expensive. It takes energy to fight immune battles all the time.
So the deer would do that and we have fewer Borrelia, and the mice just say, we're going to die anyway, we might as well sustain an infection.
Yeah,
as
that's
it were.
right. It's
From an
basically, you know,
evolution, who cares? I've got lots of kids.
that's right. I'm gonna die in the talons of an owl or the teeth of a bobcat very quickly. So why bother, you know, protecting myself against illness? That's not gonna kill me.
So a shameless plug for a Cary in the City we're doing next fall. Barbara Hahn is going to be talking about why this live fast, die young thing is really important for disease spillover more generally. But we'll get back to ticks and Lyme.
Sounds good.
So one of the things that we love to talk about at the Institute is why we love opossums and why opossums are our heroes. And I noticed tonight we have, these slides are as much as anything to remind me and Rick what we're supposed to be talking about and for how long. We have heroes and villains. Can you talk about the heroes and villains of Lyme disease?
I can't necessarily see the slides very
That's
well,
fine.
but
I think you can handle it without it.
but yes, that's fine. The opossums are heroes. So work conducted by Felicia Keesing and me and our collaborators at the Cary Institute and Bard College determined that opossums walk around on the forest floor and are magnets for ticks. They hoover up plenty of ticks, but they end up grooming them off and killing them. So it's kind of sweet revenge, right? The tick wants to bite you, well, the opossum turns the tables and bites the tick in the process of grooming. And we've estimated that an individual opossum during the midsummer peak of larval activity can kill several thousand ticks in a week. So this is not a small effect, it's a big one. Yeah. Why opossums are such fastidious groomers? They don't look like they'd be particularly careful, but
a little sloppy, yeah.
They are, in fact. They are the heroes of hoovering up and killing ticks. But it's a very complex system. There are a lot of players involved. And you know, the villains are the pathogens that make us sick, the tick that injects those pathogens into our bodies, and the white-footed mice and some other small mammals like chipmunks and shrews, which behave similarly to the mice, but not quite as dramatically. They are good hosts. They don't groom very well, and they are very good in infecting the ticks with these pathogens. Right. So we could consider them villains, although I have a fondness for mice. I sort of owe my career to them. Yeah.
So you and Felicia Keesing, your collaborator, have had a sort of, I wouldn't even call it a sideline, sort of another branch of research on looking at the importance of biodiversity more generally to disease and the prevalence of disease in an ecosystem. Can you talk about how biodiversity affects ticks and therefore Lyme?
Yeah. So these villains and heroes, as we've been calling them, a little anthropocentric, but nevertheless useful, they're not random. So in other words, there's a pattern as to who the villains are and who the heroes are. The villains tend to be small-bodied things that reproduce very rapidly and are extremely ecologically resilient. They're the species that thrive when we chop up forest into little bits, when we degrade forest, when we otherwise disturb the environment. The mice do great when we make the environment degraded or more fragmented. The same is not true of some of these heroes, the big-bodied organisms that require healthier environment. They require larger tracts of land to make their living because they're larger bodied, they need more space. Many of them are more carnivorous. They need more space to find enough food. So when we fragment the landscape, we lose diversity, but we're not losing just any animals. We're losing the ones that tend to protect us, and we're favoring the ones that tend to make us sick. And so that's why when we protect biodiversity, we tend to reduce our risk of exposure. When we chop up forest and cause the decline of these heroes, then we exacerbate our risk. And at the same time, when we chop up forest because we're developing housing developments, then we're not only making matters worse, making more infected ticks out there, but we're plunking our backyards right down in the middle of harm's way, inadvertently, of course.
So not dissimilarly to fires in the West, where the problem isn't the fire, the problem is that we've built houses where there's a high probability of having a fire.
Right.
Similarly, here, the problem is not the ticks and the mice. The problem is we built houses where there are likely to be ticks and mice, and even more so, we fed back the process by building houses, by fragmenting the landscape. We've made more habitat for things like mice and chipmunks, and therefore the ticks are better at the density of ticks is higher, the probability of infection is higher, and we're living there.
Yes, if the ticks had the capability, they'd be really grateful.
Yeah, they would. And how has climate change affected this? Because you mentioned that was an issue. So we've got fragmentation, we've got biodiversity, and sort of the third thing that you've studied a lot is the impacts of climate change.
Right. So I had mentioned from the outset that one thing that is clear that climate change is doing is it's accelerating the activity by the ticks, bringing them out earlier and earlier, and that's a potential problem, catching us unawares. There are other ways in which climate change is influencing our risk of exposure to tick-borne disease. As a scientist, we're trained to ask very precise questions about climate change and whatever is responding to climate change. So we try to be specific about what aspects of the climate and what aspects of tick biology or Lyme disease ecology are responding. And not everything does, but one thing that has been found is that when the warm season lengthens, when the warm season extends further and further into the fall and early winter, then the ticks have a longer period of time to find a host. So those ticks that don't find a host, they die because that's all they eat. If they have a longer time to find a host, then they're more likely to survive. That lengthening of the warm season appears at least in part responsible for ticks moving to the north, to the west, away from the coasts, to more harsher environments and up in elevation as well.
Right.
So in contrast, it does not look like changes in how cold it gets in the middle of winter have any impact. At least our data, 25 years at the Cary Institute, show no impact of winter cold on tick biology. So they're not killed off by cold snaps, polar vortices, and the like. So that's one aspect of the climate that does not appear to be having an effect, but others are.
Right. And folks should know we're going to talk about one project towards the end where Rick has taken all this wonderful data and is actually trying to figure out whether, I think in summary, we can kill enough ticks to reduce the incidence of Lyme disease. But there's another major project that you're working on in addition to the 25-year long-term study on climate change in ticks. And I think people might be surprised to find out who the funder is for that.
Well, the funder is a consortium of the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the EPA.
Right.
So the Department of Defense has been concerned about climate change for a long time because it influences our national security in very clear ways. So they have funded a number of different research projects that look at the impact of climate change on human disease, infectious disease, but also on wildlife infectious disease as well. And so we're conducting this research by necessity on military bases spread between northern New York and North Carolina, where there's a huge gradient of climatic conditions. And we're testing what it is that kills ticks under these different conditions.
And when you say by necessity, that's because the terms of the grant are that the only limiting factor on the grant is the research needs to be done on military property.
That's correct.
Okay. So, but it is interesting to me because we don't tend to hear about the things that the federal government is doing for climate change research. I mean, other than the release of the assessment, the fourth national climate assessment, and other things. But there is a fair amount of funding, particularly from DoD and on this issue, because they don't. If you've been to Annapolis recently, the Navy doesn't have the luxury of wondering whether climate change actually is happening. They're trying to figure out how to harden their bases and keep them from flooding. So.
That's right. I mean, they have no choice but to accept the science, and they do, and they're trying to understand what the implications are.
Right. All right. So most everybody here lives in the city, so you think you're safe because there aren't that many ticks. There are lots of mice and rats, but there aren't that many places to interact. But we did pull some data, and Rick, why don't you talk to us a little bit about Lyme disease in New York City, because it's local, and also just why local travel might present a risk.
So there is tick-borne disease in New York City. There's a fair bit of it. There are numbers in this slide, which I can't see, that are estimates that are based on the actual reported number of cases. So these are reported cases to the CDC by their very strict surveillance definition, multiplied by 10. And the reason they're multiplied by 10 is because scientists at the CDC have determined that their national statistics are undercounting Lyme disease cases by approximately a factor of 10. So there's a lot of Lyme disease. There are cases of other tick-borne diseases in New York City, but these are cases where the person's address is the location where that disease case is ascribed. It is evident that the majority, one might even say the vast majority of those cases of tick-borne disease were contracted outside of New York City itself.
Right.
Because New York City is surrounded by extremely high-risk areas on all sides, except for the Atlantic Ocean, where the ticks have not invaded yet.
Right.
But there are some locally acquired cases, and Staten Island is one place where the tick problem is large and growing. There are isolated areas within the Bronx where there are also black-legged ticks. And the black-legged tick is not the only important tick. There are other important ones as well. The American dog tick is widespread in New York City. The Lone Star tick is not widespread, but it occurs in the city. Both of them are capable of transmitting nasty things.
Yep.
And now we're seeing an invasion by the longhorned tick, which evolved in Eastern Asia. It was introduced years ago into New Zealand, and it has been introduced into Eastern North America as well. It is also a huge problem. It is expanding dramatically. So far as we know right now, it is not infected with any tick-borne pathogens. In its native range, it transmits a horrible thing. It's called severe illness with thrombocytopenia syndrome. It's a virus that causes a hemorrhagic fever, in essence, not something you ever want to get. The longhorn ticks that have been tested in the U.S. have not been found, none of them have been found to be infected with it. There is concern, though, that they can bite the same wildlife and livestock hosts that the black-legged ticks bite. Those guys might, in turn, be infected because of black-legged ticks injecting nasty things into them. So the potential exists for this longhorn tick to be a problem.
A vector for the same things that the black-legged tick is.
Potentially so.
Yeah. Okay.
It needs further study, but it is also it is invading New York City and environs as well. So it's something that we need to keep our eye on.
So I'm going to break and tell a very short story. About 3.5 years ago, Rick came into my office and said, "Got a call from somebody called Bridgespan Philanthropic. Do you know them?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, they want me to put in a proposal. And I've got an idea, but it's going to be expensive. And I said, "How expensive?" And he said, "Give me a couple days." And he came back, and being a scientist, he was precise, $8.8 million, right? And I said, "Fine." So, nothing lost if we ask for $8.8 million. And to our surprise, they gave us $5 million. And Bridgespan was working for the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, and that is what launched on the right side of the slide. You'll see something called the Tick Project. But you've heard enough about ticks and the diseases they carry to know that the question of can we kill enough ticks to make a difference was sort of at the center of what Rick was proposing to do. So would you like to, on this slide, since you're not, since you're blinded, could you go through the sort of history of how you got to the structure of and the scale of the effort that we are now more than halfway through on the Tick Project?
Sure. Right. So, I would say that most of the research that I've done on tick-borne disease has been what we might call basic research, or some of us call it pure research, where the goal is really to understand the system better. We want to understand what are the interactions important in producing risk to us of getting exposed to tick-borne disease. And that drives me quite a bit because I would really like to understand the system better and better all the time. At the same time, we know that it's an enormous problem, that people are getting sick. They're remaining sick. A few people are dying from this, or they're debilitated, or they have lifelong illness as a consequence. And another type of research is called applied research. And that is attempting to collect the scientific data that would allow one to develop and test some kind of intervention that improves our lot in life. So that's what the Tick Project is trying to do. We are not necessarily trying to understand the system any better. I have other projects that are doing that. This one is trying to solve problems. And so one of the things that's concerned me is that there's been a fair bit of basic research that has identified various products. There are things we know that kill ticks. Mm-hmm. None of them has ever been demonstrated to protect human health against tick-borne disease. Why is that? Well, the main reason why that's the case is that the studies have not been well funded, and as a consequence, they have not been designed in a particularly rigorous way. That's why I came up to you with an $8.8 million project. If you really want to ask whether you can kill ticks aggressively enough to protect human health by reducing the per capita incidence of disease, it's expensive. And so the Tick Project is that expensive and hopefully effective project. We were intrigued with a study that was published just a few years ago by scientists, mostly from the CDC, but their collaborators as well, in which it was a huge sample of individual backyards, something like 1,200 in 3 different states, where they sprayed bifenthrin, which is a synthetic pyrethroid. It's a tick-killing chemical, in these backyards 1 or 2 years in a row. And they reduced ticks in these people's yards by about 63% on average. Unfortunately, though, that 63% reduction in tick abundance had absolutely no effect on the number of people who got sick or the number of people who found ticks crawling on them. So we began to think, well, why is that? And there are several possibilities, and we tried to address those in the design of the Tick Project. One is that 63% sounds like a lot. It is. That's a big reduction. That might not be enough.
So maybe, there may be a threshold.
There may be a lower threshold, and we've got to clobber the ticks even more aggressively. That's one thing the Tick Project does with 2 interventions. Another is that just spraying once or 1 year or 2 years in a row might not be enough. Maybe you need a cumulative effect to get ticks low and keep them low. A third possibility is that this spraying was done on individual people's backyards. What if people get exposed to infected ticks in their neighbor's yard, or while they're walking their dog, or recreating, or somewhere down the street, or elsewhere? Then spraying in their backyards alone might not be enough. So the Tick Project attempts to redress all those potential shortcomings, clobbering the ticks even harder with 2 different interventions, doing this for 5 consecutive years. We're starting year 4 this month. And then also doing this at the level of entire neighborhoods. So a neighborhood defined as about 100 adjacent houses, where we have recruited participants so that we have between 30 and 50 or 60% of the houses, of the households, cooperating with us.
And that variation is good because it will allow you to see how many of the households you might need to make this work.
That's exactly right. And we're also applying the sort of scientific gold standard. So the study is randomized, so we randomly selected, among all our 24 different neighborhoods, we randomly selected which ones would receive which treatments, kind of like a pharmaceutical drug design. So it was randomized. It is placebo-controlled, so that we're spraying a tick-killing fungus, so it's a biocontrol agent. But we're in the control plots, these control neighborhoods, we're spraying water. So the residents and our researchers don't know, and it's double blind. Right. So those are the characteristics of the heights of scientific rigor, but we're doing it in the field rather than in test tubes or in individual human patients.
Yeah. And the second treatment is getting the mice and the chipmunks to run through boxes and self-dose themselves with Frontline, or the active ingredient.
That's right.
Frontline.
Yeah, right. Some people refer to these as mouse car washes, where I wish they acted that quickly. They don't, but it's not as though they walk in dirty and walk out clean. But within a few hours, they walk into a little box, because mice and chipmunks and shrews love to walk into little holes in things, as you may have noticed if you ever have them in your home. And then they self-apply a little drop of fipronil, which is the main ingredient in Frontline, and that kills the ticks and, incidentally, also the fleas on them. So now the mice are clean. They couldn't groom on their own, so we helped them out. And so we're killing the ticks on mice, which are the most important ticks to kill, because those are the ones that get infected. Right. But our placebo controls for those are bait boxes that simply lack any fipronil. Right. So the residents and my field researchers have no idea which treatment is in that
And you and
neighborhood.
Felicia have not known which treatment until very recently.
We have still not unblinded.
Oh, you have not
No,
unblinded yet.
once you unblind a study, you can never go back.
Okay.
So we will be doing that very shortly.
This is the
because
3 blind mice study, sorry.
two of us.
Yeah. And you mentioned partners. I mean, I think what's remarkable about this is, the CDC is a partner, New York State Health is a partner in Dutchess County. So if any of you have houses outside the city and want to know whether you can be part of the study, unfortunately not this study, because we've already picked the neighborhoods, we picked the participants, but the state and the local county health department, which is now the Department of
Behavioral and Community Health, I think.
Right? They changed their name recently. Have all been partners in this, so it's
right.
not just a lot of people, and you've developed technologies and an ability for people to text, get a text message and reply to it, and it was quite
It's
an
a big
endeavor,
undertaking.
right?
It is.
And as a scientist, you're not used to dealing with that many people as a biologist.
I am not.
Yeah.
I avoid them, actually.
yeah.
So
We generally like animals more than we like people, which is why we end up in the field.
Speak
we
for
do.
yourself, Josh.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
No, this was my first foray into human subjects research. I've never done it before,
Right.
so we have to get all kinds of permissions, and they're tremendous and very important, valuable safeguards for people's anonymity, their privacy, and the like.
Right.
So there were lots of layers of red tape, but very important red tape.
And I'll talk a little more about the funding, but we've been very fortunate. The state in the first year gave us $100,000. Last year they gave us almost $200,000. Last year there was $1 million in the state budget for Lyme disease education and prevention and research. And in their inimicable way and infinite wisdom, on Sunday, just before the budget was locked up, they pulled $1 million out, and there's now nothing in the budget for that. So this is just something you should know, that, again, next year, when we get to the next slide, Lori, and what you can do, thank you. What you can do also is write your representatives and say, Lyme disease and tick-borne disease is the fastest growing zoonotic disease in the country. New York State and this region of New York State is the epicenter of these illnesses, and it just doesn't make any sense to pull the small amount of funding. I mean, if this is a $8.8 million project, you can see that this research and the education and the outreach is hugely important. And right now it's private entities. The Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation put $50 million into the Lyme work because Alex had chronic Lyme, and so she got behind it. And when your husband is a venture capitalist and a hedge fund manager and has $10 billion, you can do that. But it's really an important thing. So what else can people do to protect themselves and to help ameliorate these issues?
Well, so to protect themselves, people can use repellents.
Right.
There are both chemical ones like DEET and picaridin, IR 3535.
Right. Does it have a brand name?
If it does, I don't recall what it is.
All right.
Those do work moderately well. They're not perfect, but they do work. There are permethrin products that can be applied to clothes, or pre-treated clothes can be purchased, and those slightly repel the ticks, but better yet, they kill them. It turns you into an opossum, essentially.
Or Rick Ostfeld.
Yes, right. Potentially, although good luck with that. And then there are some essential oils that almost always are less effective than DEET and picaridin and the like, but they do have some efficacy, like garlic oil may repel things other than ticks. There is rosemary oil. There is a product that can be extracted out of Alaska yellow cedar or also out of citrus. The chemical is called nucatone. It smells like grapefruits, and it's food grade, so it's non-toxic. And these all have some kind of an effect. Doing tick checks is very important. Knowing what the early symptoms are of Lyme disease, flu-like symptoms outside the flu season, like in May, June, and July, that's the peak season.
Right.
Knowing what ticks look like is a really good idea, knowing how to get them out.
Little tiny spiders with small legs and big bodies.
Well, when they're first starting to feed, their bodies are not that big. So, right. And the nymphs never get all that big. So, having a good eye, knowing your freckle pattern could be very useful for finding a new one, which happens to be moving.
Right.
So those are some of the things that people can do.
And when you're out, I mean, so the one thing I think we want to emphasize is it is not a good idea to just not go outside, right? You know, we both have relatively young children. I know my 13-year-old loves to run around outside in bare feet and shorts, and I try and scare her to death, but it doesn't work. And so, you know, checking for ticks, showers afterwards, can, if they haven't implanted, can wash them off, but also just, you know, because when you shower and you wash, you feel yourself and you can actually
Sure.
feel the bump. So
Yeah.
that all helps, but you know, I think the no child left out, you know, no child left inside strategy is an important one. So we don't want to tell people that the only way to solve this problem is to sit and play video games all day long instead of for just 6 or 7 hours a day.
Yeah, I know that, Joe. Well,
Yeah.
this is one of the motivations for developing the Tick Project is, you know, we do want to take back the outdoors. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the bylines of this evening's event. You know, we don't want people to be afraid to go outdoors. There are huge benefits to outdoor activities of all different kinds, and we don't want those to be avoided or foregone simply because there's a risk of tick bite. That's a big risk, but there are ways that we can reduce it. And maybe they're large-scale ways, and that's why we developed the Tick Project and are working so hard at it.
Right. And you know, we've talked about supporting science. I mean, it befuddles me and confuses me and sometimes saddens me that I am living in an era where I actually have to say the words, science is important, science is real. Science is a process, not an endpoint, and so we keep finding out new things and they supplant the old things, and sometimes what we found out before was wrong, but that doesn't mean that we're lying or fabricating our data or we're evil. And so, you know, it is a time in which standing up for science is really important as well.
Absolutely.
You know, oddly, sorry to have to say that. And I've mentioned 3 times, so I'll mention it one more time. Use your voice. You know, write people in power who have control over budgets, both at the federal and the state levels. Advocate for yourself and your communities. And stay tuned because in 2 years, we'll have results from the Tick
We will.
Project. Okay. And I think there is a great hope that this will work. There's also, I think, a great importance that if it doesn't work, it's equally important that we let everyone know what the results were. Because there are a lot of people who go around and say, I can spray your yard and I can spray your community and that will reduce your problem.
Right.
So it's
yeah,
important.
It's true.
So we've been chatting for about 45 minutes, and I suspect there might be some questions. So we want to open it up to questions, and hands pop up. We've got a microphone. Gentleman in the striped shirt, I'm going to work across and back and over.
Well, thank you both for a very informative evening. It's been, I think all of us feel, many of us feel we're screwed, but what are we going to do? Anyway, so you said that the black-legged tick doesn't crawl very well.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean if we avoid walking through grass or touching leaves or brushing against them, that for the most part we'll be pretty safe? Can they fall off a leaf that you walk? If there's a tree that's overhanging a walkway, can a tick fall onto you and infect you that way? Or, as I say,
Mm-hmm.
is it obviously if you don't touch any of the vegetation, are you really much, much better off?
So you are much better off if you don't touch the vegetation. The ticks can seek a host on the ground, but they'll often climb onto at least low vegetation to try to find some animal brushing by. So you're not 100% safe by avoiding the vegetation, but you are reducing some of your risk. They don't climb trees. Sometimes people find a tick high on their bodies, back of the neck, behind their ears, their armpit, something like that. And they assume that that's because the tick got on them at that height. But that's almost certainly not the case. What the ticks will do is they'll get on you at your foot or ankle level, and then they'll crawl around. They take their time. They don't motor very fast, but it could be hours while they're looking around, trying to figure out what's the best place where I can embed my mouth parts. I'm invoking my inner tick here, and drink this person's blood. They have to be embedded in your skin and drinking your blood for 3 or 4 days to fill up. So they need to be very secretive and hide from you. So that's they choose places where you might imagine a tick could hide, and I guess I'll leave it at that. And so you might find them in places where it took them a couple hours to crawl there. You don't have to worry about them flying or falling out of trees, though.
Woman in the middle.
If you want to make a path through the woods.
Okay, so we'll just repeat the question. Keep going.
If you want to make a path through the woods, it's a true cedar bark. It helps repel ticks.
Does a path through the woods covered in cedar bark help repel ticks?
So this nootkatone that I mentioned is made from Alaska yellow cedar. So that's different from the red cedar that it's often used here in the East and elsewhere. To my knowledge, red cedar has not been shown to have any repellent or tick-killing properties. So there are various websites that urge homeowners to create a woodchip barrier at the edge of their yard. And especially, so a woodchip barrier might be a little more difficult for a tick to crawl across. If it's made of Alaska yellow cedar wood chips, then they're not going to even try. The problem is that a barrier, that the ticks don't move far on their own anyway. The way they're getting into your yard from the adjacent woods is on a host, a mouse, a chipmunk, a shrew, a squirrel. And that woodchip barrier will do nothing to prevent those animals. So there is no strong indication that that's an effective strategy of protecting your property.
Will it protect you while you're walking on that path?
If it's Alaska yellow cedar, yeah, you can be pretty sure it's tick-free, but if it's another kind of cedar, probably not.
Okay, someone's got a mic in the back, so you get to go.
I don't know if it's working.
We can hear you.
Great. I'm wondering about the pesticide interventions and if you think the pesticide might have a negative effect on biodiversity in general and on our health as human beings. And speaking to Silent Spring when there were massive sprays of pesticide in the 60s, that from the research that I've done, that is known to have actually exacerbated the growth of tick populations and Lyme disease itself. And I'm wondering if you anticipate that that could have an effect on the backlash of Lyme disease itself and the ability of the disease to evolve and come back with a vengeance.
It's a set of good questions.
Yes, those are great questions. So the product that we're spraying to try to kill ticks is not a chemical pesticide. It is a fungus. It actually is a naturally occurring fungus, so we're not even introducing an exotic species, which is often done when one undertakes biocontrol. And it's even a native strain of that fungus. It's not genetically modified in any way. It's been well tested and found to have no toxic effect on vertebrate animals, of which we are one. And we tested it at the beginning of the tick project to see if it killed non-target arthropods, insects, spiders, and similar creatures. And we found no effect on non-target arthropods. So this is a deliberate choice we made to use a biocontrol agent, a naturally occurring fungus, without harmful side effects for non-target organisms. The chemical that we're using, this fipronil, is in the bait boxes. It is applied to the mice. They self-apply it in tiny doses, minute doses. And it, too, is non-toxic to vertebrates. It's what we use in Frontline on our dogs and cats. So the mice are not harmed in any way, nor are the things that eat them. So we made a deliberate choice to avoid broadcast spraying any chemical pesticides in the environment for many of the reasons that you mentioned. And we are using products that are available, that we think will be affordable, and that are safe for people, pets, and the environment, with the hope that if it works, then we can actually recommend it and not be doing damage to the environment while we're trying to protect human health.
Yeah. And also, neither of those are killing the Borrelia directly.
That's right.
So the problem of coevolution or an arms race with a pathogen doesn't, what we're trying to do is break the link with the vector. Right? And so it wouldn't necessarily affect the evolution of the pathogen if we're killing its host, unless it goes off and finds new hosts, which would be in evolutionary time somewhat more difficult because they're pretty Catholic they're just like mammal blood, or actually not just mammal, bird blood as well. So we have a mic here, and then we'll have a question here. So if we can move the mic up to the front.
So is there a reason why, my voice really carries, is there a reason why I shouldn't kill every white-footed mouse on my property? Do they serve any function at all other than to infect
Nymphal ticks
with Lyme disease?
Yeah, I'm sorry, but they do. They are actually, this is true of most species, that, we impose our values on those species and asking questions about what their function is. And it's clear that we don't value the role that mice play in infecting and producing lots of nasty ticks that can make us sick. But they do control, for instance, they attack the cocoon stage in the gypsy moth life cycle, and they're capable of regulating gypsy moths and preventing them from undergoing outbreaks. Gypsy moth outbreaks are a bad thing. They kill millions of trees. They're an exotic imported pest from Europe. They also serve as a critically important prey for all kinds of different mammal, bird, and reptile predators. And without white-footed mice, those foxes, owls, hawks, snakes, and other creatures that we value and that serve very important roles in ecosystems would be scarcer. So that's why we're trying to kill the ticks on the mice rather than trying to kill the mice. Or if we can protect large tracts of forest, then we're helping the predators who catch and kill and eat the mice do their job. So we're trying to avoid taking away controls of the mice, but it's practically impossible to control mice ourselves over a large area, and probably undesirable for many ecological functions.
Okay, before you ask your question, you've reminded me we have a group here who has helped support it this evening, Hollander Design. Thank you very much. And without naming names, because it's confidential, they did help design a property that excluded ticks. And the way you did it was by building a property that excluded rodents. And they could tell you it was not easy. It was very expensive. It requires killing all the rodents that are inside once you erect the barriers, and then monitoring ad infinitum, because there are things that could carry rodents over those barriers. So on a very small scale, if you have a lot of money and really want to kill all the mice in your property, you can do it. But there are probably easier ways to avoid Lyme disease. Certainly, there are less expensive ways. It may not be as effective. Right? Is that a fair summary of the process, Brian? Yeah, okay, good. It's a challenge. We have a question here and then a question there.
Yes, if you had if a mouse gets into your house, and you, let's say, catch it in a trap or whatever, does the tick actually on that mouse, and if it's in your house, does that mean the tick is in your house and could bite you?
The tick is in your house, if the mouse is, but that tick is a happy tick that is not going to turn tail and bite you. So if the mouse has, they often, at the Cary Institute where we do our work, a single mouse can have 20, 30, 50, 100 ticks on it. When I give a scientific seminar, as long as it's not right after lunch, I like to show a picture of mice that are just covered, their ears are covered with these ticks.
Disgusting.
So, but those ticks will feed on that mouse for about 3 or 4 days, drinking blood that whole time. Then they're finished. They can't drink anymore, or they pop, and they drop off the mouse, and then that tick will not become active and look for another host for almost a whole year. So, and it's not going to survive in your house for that length of time. Even in humid weather, it's too dry for these ticks to survive. So, and the same is true of the ticks that are on your pets. It's not the ticks that are embedded in the skin and drinking the blood of your pets or your unwanted guests, like the mice. It's the ones that have not embedded yet, that like the ones that are crawling around on your dog's fur that might choose you instead. But if they are taking a blood meal, don't worry about them, although, you might want to get rid of the mouse.
So we have a question here, and then can you hand that back? Right, very good, perfect.
Quick medical question. If you find yourself having been bitten by a tick, I've heard varying things on this, but is it taking 40 milligram doxycycline? Is it 200? Okay, 200 milligram doxycycline sufficient to prevent an infection within 48 hours, I guess I've been told.
So in protecting the Cary Institute, which is one of my jobs, he's a doctor, but not that kind of doctor. Anyway, Dr. Ostfeld, if you'd like.
This is a question that should be asked of a medical professional, a physician or a physician researcher. I read this literature, but I'm not as familiar with it well enough to give you an answer as to the efficacy of that treatment.
I've heard both from medical professionals. So.
It is
Yes
controversial.
and no.
It is controversial, yes.
Sir.
What about increasing the population of opossum and raccoon? Is that something that you've considered or thought about?
Well, so it's very hard to manage ecological systems for particular species. So how you would do that is unclear to me. There's confusion about our opossums. The vernacular, people call them possums, but there actually is a thing. There are actually several species of possums. It's a different kind of marsupial that lives in Australia. And so I've had people proclaim proudly that they just came across building design for possum nest boxes, and if we could only install enough of these here in New York State, we would induce the opossums to proliferate and solve our Lyme problem. They are boxes for possums without the O, which is a vastly different creature, and it would be totally useless for opossums. So there are people who are thinking about these kinds of things, but we don't know how to manage for opossums. We honestly don't even know what limits their population abundance.
It's not their birth rate.
It is not their birth rate.
Because they have lots of kids.
They have lots of babies. But what we could do in a practical sense to encourage them to occur, other than avoiding damaging the environment so badly that they can no longer eke out a living.
So we're going to have one more question. We could go on all night, but WNYC probably wouldn't like that. So we'll have one more question, and then we'll do a quick wrap-up.
That's good.
Sir.
Yep. Many people say that loose chickens are very good to eat ticks, and guinea hens are even better. Many townships prohibit them loose. First, are they effective in your research? They're definitely easier to raise than opossums, and also better biodiversity.
So there was an intriguing early scientific paper, I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, that claimed that guinea fowl were effective at reducing tick populations. It was a small study, not much replication. Might be right. So we repeated the study years later and compared properties in Dutchess County that had guinea fowl with those that didn't and never had, but were within a kilometer or so. And we found no difference, no statistical difference between the two. So guinea fowl might occasionally eat ticks, but it did not appear as though from our analysis that they had a strong effect. I've looked through the scientific literature. I've made formal literature searches to look for science behind the claim that chickens can control tick populations, and there is nothing out there. Anyone who is interested in designing a scientific experiment, I would direct you towards chickens and ticks. There is no evidence that chickens control ticks, and there's a difference between finding that a predator eats a prey species and that predator actually controls the abundance of that prey. It's an important difference. So it has not been demonstrated that chickens do that. That is not to say that we know they don't, but before one would argue forcefully for the use of chickens as a tick control means, I think having that evidence would be very important.
Well, and as you said, there was that CDC study that suggested that a 63% decline in ticks didn't reduce the incidence of disease in humans.
That's right.
So if the idea is to reduce ticks, chickens might help, but they'd have to do an awful lot of tick reduction to reduce Lyme disease.
They would, and it simply hasn't been demonstrated
Right.
as the reality.
So there are a bunch of hands, and I feel always churlish at this moment, cutting this off. We'll hang out in the lobby. Happy to talk to you. You know, you have, I think, garnered in the last hour how long it takes to understand what appears to be relatively simple, but in the end is not a relatively simple system, and how difficult and expensive it is to apply that knowledge, 25 years of research, to the simple question of how many ticks do you need to kill over what scale to reduce the incidence of tick-borne disease. As Rick said to me 4 years ago, and he said to you this evening, it's not cheap to do this research. Right? The reason it hasn't been done up until now is quite simply because the idea of spending almost $9 million to answer this question didn't occur to anyone as something that was possible. We again thank the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation for their tremendous faith in Rick and his colleagues and saying, yeah, we'll take a gamble on it. We thank the rest of you who have given us another $2 million directly or in kind to help it. And anybody who's really good with math knows that means we have about another $2 million to raise. We were hoping the state would help us with that. They're not, but you can. And I really believe that if you are interested in figuring out whether we can solve this problem, supporting this project is probably one of the best things you can do to help eliminate the scourge of Lyme disease. So thank you for coming tonight. Please tell your friends, if you enjoyed this, please tell your friends about it. We'll be doing some more next year, and we really appreciate your learning more about the Cary Institute, and tonight learning more about Lyme disease and ticks. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.